So thank you for having me, and thank you for staying here for the last group. It's been a great few days of presentation, so I'm happy to be among that. As Valerie mentioned, we just reopened this past March, what I consider phase one. We're still looking on money to finish out the grand plan. But it's been a long process that began in 2015, before my tenure even at the C.M. Russell Museum, where they took conservation was the bulk of the money that had been spent to redo these spaces, and taking care also of the artifact collection, basically taking it out of the studio, which it had been in since 1930. So these objects needed some care. So it's again thinking about how to reinterpret these spaces, which unfortunately we won't have many of the objects in the collection that were Russell's, like so many of the other sites had. But just to begin with a little history, both properties have had a long history in Great Falls. The house was built in 1900 and the studio in 1903, and they were in use until the artist's death, C.M. Russell, in 1926. Just a little brief overview: C.M. Russell was born in 1864, died in 1926, and I would say the three major themes of his paintings are Native Americans, cowboys, and wildlife, so you can kind of get an idea and understanding of his artwork. But as much even here as the cabin may look out of place in the downtown neighborhood of Great Falls, not much has changed in that respect. At the time of its building, the artist was worried that he might offend the sensible tastes of his neighbors, building a log cabin out in the nice gentrified wealthy street in Great Falls. But his wife Nancy needed to kick him out of the house, because living with an artist and sharing a space with painting, and when you're trying to entertain and all these can, I'm sure, bother anyone, and he needed his own room of his own, so to speak. So they went forward with building this cabin next door, which was based off of this cabin he lived in Utica, Montana, when he was cowboying and living with this eccentric hunter-trapper named Jake Hoover. And so he had such fond memories of the time that they built a studio in the same vein, but used telephone poles instead of cabin wood. So there's this interesting connection between contemporary materials and this historic vision that he had. And you can just see here too, I don't have some of the best slides, but our museum is tucked between the two spaces. The studio is on this side, our museum is in the back, and then the house is right there. But in part of a larger memorialization effort of Nancy Russell after her husband's death, the house, studio, and artifact collection were given as a partial gift and purchase to the city of Great Falls, Montana in 1928, and the studio opened to the public on July 4th, 1930. We were one of the first museums to be opened, especially considering with Western art as well in the country. Even I think at the same time, either the Whitney or something was opened at the MoMA at the same time in 1930. So we have kind of a long history there. And you can just see that this is the gallery edition from the 1930s. Again, she hung prints that were then sold out of here, and she even sold bronzes through other people as a part of a larger memorialization effort for Russell. But the museum, in 1991, it was acquired from the city of Great Falls to the C.M. Russell Museum, and then the museum staff promptly began a conservation effort. They built new casework. You can see, again, this is a studio edition in the 1990s, 2015, but this was installed in 1990. And you can just see the kind of casework that they had built throughout the log cabin, and just kind of a hodgepodge there. The house itself was never conserved. It just had a remodel in the 1970s through the efforts of the Garden Club, kind of donating period-esque furniture for the use that we still had to contend with today in a lot of ways. But the interpretation effort was largely object focused in the studio, and the house was really basically only an introduction with a few photographs of the artist and his wife who lived there. And you can see here, basically these spaces were all barricaded off by this plexi wall that you can see, so you could only go through this small narrow corridor. Sorry, I've got kind of hodgepodge of images there. But you couldn't really interact. You can just kind of peer through this plexi case. So part of the main thing we wanted to do, especially since many of these objects are now in our happy storage space in our vaults, that we really wanted to open the space up to the visitors and grant closer access and discovery. So the goal of our most recent reinterpretation was to create a robust and connected interpretive plan that integrated storylines and major themes in both spaces, as well as to evoke as best we could echoes of the Russells' lives, designing the spaces with historic use in mind by pulling from old photographs and sources in books and archives that documented their lives, friends, and routines. One of the major things was we sought to emphasize the roles that women played in Charles Russell's life, especially that of Nancy, who shepherded Charles's career as his business manager, saleswoman, and promoter. Here's just an example of some of the images we took in the text panel graphics. And really wanted to talk about Nancy's upbringing as an orphan. She was orphaned at age 13. Her mother died of typhoid. And then she had to work in a house helping out with the family and the children and cooking. That's where she met Russell. And in some ways I kind of characterize her at that moment with her hard scrabble background as a sort of Scarlett O'Hara with I'll never be hungry again. And what she found Charlie Russell, she made sure that Charlie Russell succeeded, because he was this kind of wayward cowboy who was, sometimes he'd give paintings to satisfy bar tabs and that effect. So he wasn't really interested in fame or fortune. He came from a wealthy family, but he was happy living his life as a sort of cowboy and just kind of a fine painter in Montana. But she really had a bigger vision for them, and so she made that happen. Again, just showing here is like one of the upstairs rooms. Really a major point is injecting these little tidbits of stories that I can find in the archives and through some unpublished biographies of Russell that Nancy wrote. And one of the main things that came up and that we can talk about in the upstairs room, which has more personal spaces, is about her interest in fashion and clothing. She was a pretty well put together woman when she had the means to do so. And there's this great story about this fur stole, which used to be a fur coat. When they first made their trip to New York to, sell Russell to illustrators and get his work out there, someone wanted to buy a Russell painting, and before Charlie could say, just take that for $50, she said $300, and he was floored that they took that and said, sure, I'll write the check right here. And so he gave her the difference in that price, and she promptly went out and bought herself a fur coat, as a signal of their new, wealth. And then later when they moved to California for the winter, she cut it down to her fur stole. So these little stories like to inject in. Another emphasis for us too was the friendships and advocacy that Russell had with Native peoples. And especially, at least in this rotational aspect of our storytelling, we really want to focus on the Chippewa Cree tribe and the formation of the Rocky Boy Reservation, which is between Great Falls and Havre, Montana, and north central Montana. This is a few photographs of John Youngboy, who modeled, and you can see this is like their early home in Great Falls before they moved to the one in 1900, but how Russell would use him as a model. But he would exchange artworks with John Youngboy and illustrated letters, and John would give Russell his, armbands and decorated vests and all these gifts, and he sold him one of his beloved horses, Nina. So they really had more than just an artist-model relationship. It was a true friendship, and they truly cared about each other. And so we really wanted, though we don't have that great of an archive of these figures, we really wanted to bring them in as best we could and tell their stories as well, because we thought that, again, this just enriches the narrative. Because it allows us to approach Russell in oblique ways by enriching his narrative through the people that surrounded him, and in turn allows us to discuss the experiences of more people who animated the American West. And our hope, too, is that we'll draw in new audiences and continue to educate those who think that they know the story of Russell so well and just surprise them in some ways. So the next slides, I'm just going to go through how we incorporated some of these narratives in text panels, interpretive games, technology, objects, and oral histories. So here, if you walk into the house, this is the foyer area. This is the first spot you will see. We wanted to have placed an interpretation of Nancy's original desk, which historically was installed some years later after the studio was built. So as she began taking on the role of businesswoman, manager, and marketer of Russell and his art, she herself needed a dedicated space to do the work, and we wanted to emphasize that in the reinterpretation. And here's a quote from an unpublished biography that kind of emphasizes her role. Quote, "His wife, with the butcher, the grocer, the baker, and the gas man to handle, felt the need of funds, and she began to educate herself in the business of salesmanship. When her skill grew and the prices of the artist's paintings and models began correspondingly to mount, Charles was mildly interested and fully appreciative of the new comforts which began to appear in the home, but as to the knowing of the how of the wonders his partner was working, he paid little attention to their intricacies," unquote. So he was just content to kind of chill in his studio and paint, and she took care of everything else that made it all work. So we really wanted to highlight that. And one of the great things we had was creating this desk. You can see here is filled with a lot of archives that I laboriously laminated and pulling from our archival sources as well as other museums. You know, the house contract, her notebooks and correspondence and everything. So one of the things that I continue to emphasize is that I place these little archives in places where people can just pull out if they want that deeper story, if they want to read more about Nancy and their life, or have these little tidbits that still remain that show their life. I wanted to give that. And so we don't have audio, but I'll just play some of the animation. Okay. So here basically is a ringing telephone, and you can see some of the archives that I pulled in her sculpture book here. But it's a correspondence, again, that I pulled from Malcolm McKay, who was a major patron of Russell's, and how they wrote a check for $1,800 to commission this painting, The Roundup, and how he's so pleased with Russell's work, and, you know, how they're going to come back out to New York again. And so just kind of this little snippet of, you know, her speaking in correspondence with these major patrons that made a lot of things possible. Another thing that we created too is, you know, that came to light was through the work of our historic architect Ken Sievert, whose conservation process helped us uncover many interesting details about the choices that Nancy made in the design and construction of her house. For example, here we talk about her choice to skimp on plaster. Instead of doing it 3/4 of an inch thick, she did it 1/4 of an inch, which made it really hard for the restoration process. But then they could save that money to put more details of woodwork into the house. You know, it's also, the architect found it immensely fascinating that the bottom rooms, as they were public on view, are large and opulent, and the upstairs is really, you're squeezing in. And their angles aren't right, so they really compacted the upstairs and volumized the downstairs for this. And so there's a lot of these little tidbits that really talk about, you know, what it was for a couple when they're even house hunting, even as we do today, talk about the choices that you make in maybe building a house, what their needs are and that. So we wanted to sort of convey some of that along with the great information we got through the conservation process. Here's an example of an old sitting room, and you can see it's just kind of, I don't know, it's just there and from the 70s. And again, you can see this barrier, and none of these, they are in a collection, but they're not original. So our goal was to take this all out. The beautiful wallpaper you saw on the green and this red here, we discovered the pattern and confirmed with the very few photographs that we had of the interior of the house. And they reproduced this through a printing machine, and I think that makes the biggest change in this house. But we, before he had his studio, he often would paint and do makeshift scenes in his house. So we kind of wanted to evoke that spirit of artistic creativity. And we have this easel that plays this whole, again, chit-chat between Russell and Nancy about, you know, creation in the home and how we should build you a studio and all that effect. And you can see Russell here sitting dressed up in native costume, native clothing, and just some of the interior. He did a lot of interior TP scenes in the early days, so you can kind of see that. And also too, the roles that, again, Nancy played as a model for her husband early on, and even their friend Josephine, who had worked with Nancy in Cascade, helping out at the Roberts home, She then was brought with them to Great Falls to live out and finish high school, and she got married to a friend of theirs, and lived in the Great Falls house from time helping Nancy. And so just kind of how that he used them as models for his painting. Russell rarely didn't use models that much, so he just used it with the key important people. Oh my. Okay, and so then also talk about relationships that he had with women authors, which he illustrated a lot of women authors' books. B.M. Bauer was a big Western illustrator, so I mentioned that there. The dining room, we really wanted to make this as a sales pitch, and Nancy, selling the art off the walls, so to speak. And then I even adapted this from a $2 game, which was used in bargaining and marketing opportunities in economics classes. And so I tailored this to take on a persona. In bargaining, you can get like 10% off a print if you write a receipt and bid off the art of the walls with Nancy. And then just the back pantry and the kitchen, again talking about the people who lived with her and who worked for her, just a little bit about them and their roles in her life. We also had an accessibilities ADA tour for the upstairs, and we brought a historic interpreter, Mary Jane Bradbury, in. This is a video, but I won't play it since it's not really that important, but she talks about the borders, and we go through the rooms, and we use Nancy's stories to animate that. And again, I mentioned these figures, Russell's protege, Nancy's half-sister, Josephine, who was a model who lived in these spaces. And then also talking about travel, and again injecting these old archives. Actually, when they went to London, they went there on the Oceanic and back on the Lusitania, and they both sunk in World War I, so they had good luck in that they weren't on it on those times, but bad luck in those ships both sank. But again, having these little archives tucked throughout and around the spaces. The new installation here, you can see, tore out some of the barriers, tried to do replicas of objects, and you can see some historic photos of Russell painting that we tried to evoke there. And another main section we wanted to focus on was Native voices. And a spotlight we have on two different people, and one was artist John L. Clark, who was a Blackfeet born in Highwood, Montana, 1881. He had scarlet fever age 2, became deaf, but learned woodworking, came back to East Glacier where he set up a studio in 1913 when he went away from school and became a world famous wood carver. John Rockefeller owned some of his works. He was highly promoted by Great Northern Railroad and Louis Clark, and so we just want to have some of that mentioned there. Russell and him became friends. Russell had a cabin up in Glacier National Park, and they traveled there, and he visited him and spoke with them. And so here's some examples of his work. His granddaughter came down recently. There's a book just made on John Clark, and so this next summer I'm hoping to do an oral history with her to talk more about the carver. And that's another important thing we want to do, is go to these tribes. There's 5 different reservations in Montana, and really speak with the elders there and the people that have ancestral and family memories of Russell, or people that knew Russell, even just cowboy culture and Western life, and really capture those and tell those stories here in the studio because they're so important. Russell had, he wasn't just an artist who came out west for a little bit and went back to his east to paint. He really lived out here. He has a great reputation among the tribes and tribespeople, and so that's something that we really want to convey. For example, this is John Youngboy's older brother, Buffalo Coat, and this is from 1908 when Nancy's in the studio as a marketing campaign, and there's a painting of Buffalo Coat. So just again to inject these Native aspects into the story. So for our first talk about oral history, we went to the Rocky Boy Reservation and interviewed Pearl Whitford, who is the granddaughter of John Youngboy. And that was an amazing experience to have. We worked with Jonathan Eagleman, who is a Cree language professional, and he made up Kiniak tobacco for her. We brought a Pendleton blanket and gifts, and they did this whole ceremony where they say prayers and had smoke and talked about the importance of Russell and helping establish this reservation and his just relationship with John Youngboy, and we got to capture that in some of the videos. So I'll just play this even though you can't hear it. But it was so powerful to hear her speak on her family and even her hard upbringing that we now have captured. And she's talking about how Russell and Youngboy used Native American Sign Language to communicate with one another, because he was very fluent in that. and also how her grandfather used to call for Russell in dreams to get him to come to the reservation, and just the importance and power of language and communication, and also horse culture, how they used to pray for the horses. And John Youngboy, like I said, had given Nina as a present to Russell, and so just the importance of this horse culture and Western culture. And so this plays in our gallery edition, and it's just a great movie, and it's something we're going to have a closer relationship out of this project and effect with the Rocky Boy Reservation and the Box Elder school kids. So that's very exciting. Another main thing we're having is we wanted to do a rotational overlay inside the studio that rotated each media, because Russell was conversant in multiple types of media. And so the first one focuses on sculpture, which is why we chose John Clark, who is a Blackfeet wood sculptor. But in the studio edition, you can see this little education component, which is like build an armature, and then corresponding to Smoking Up, which is the first sculpture that Russell cast in bronze. And then you can see this little sculpture book, which was fun too. Again, this is like a writing section, so again, I did choose to use vignettes, but I tried to make them more colorful. And the illustrated letter that Russell is famous for, that people love to read his letters because he has a lot of humor injected into them. But it talks to his protege, Jody Young, who is a young kid at 19. He wrote to Russell at the time asking for advice on sculpting, and Russell wrote him back, and he just thought that was so great that an artist would take the time to respond to someone like him. And he talks about where you can buy modeling clay and how he draws his armature. So we thought that'd be fun for people to read. And so again, this sculpture book I was talking about, I wanted to make it sort of find and seek in ways that people can really, if they wanted to have a quick look around the studio, they could do that. But if they want to have these long looks, like how can I get them engaged more using some low-tech ways? So we pointed out some sculpture and some similarities perhaps with his other illustrated drawings and letters, and have people kind of find and think more about these pieces. And then we built out these little, in the shells we filled it as it was historically held, all these models, and so people can go up. We commissioned an artist to create some of these, and also our preparators, who are artists, as many of you may also have preparators who are former artists. I feel like that's a big thing. But they created some of these too as well, and so it really helped us fill out these, this great object exploration of shelves and everything. And then lastly, just the gallery edition. We wanted to keep this space cleaner. We really wanted to evoke the dualities of Russell, who not only had his studio as an artistic practice, but also as a social space. So we thought by keeping this space cleaner, available for presentations, little cocktail parties, and the like, that we could have these both dualities exist within this space. And so it's just a little bit more open-ended for use. And lastly, just as I said, this is a larger project that I want to continue to work on, injecting some of these thematics of universal sort of humanities themes, and connect Russell's drawings to what's going on today with immigration, with technology change, and how can people connect issues that were present then just as they are as present now. And so those are just some of the things we were thinking on the reinterpretation. So thank you very much.